Excellent. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to see you all here. It's lovely to see such a big crowd. That's fantastic. You're very welcome this afternoon to our summer school guest lecture. And I'm really delighted to welcome the wonderful Dr. Anactoria Clarke today. So pleased to have you here, Anactoria. Many of us know Anactoria, or at the very least know of her, and her kind and generous reputation precedes her. A little bit about her: she has a PhD in English literature, specifically male doubling in late 19th century Gothic, such as Jekyll and Hyde. But that's not enough, and she's currently finishing off another PhD in classics about centaurs. Anactoria works for the Open University. She teaches English and classical studies modules, and she is Associate Director of Student Support in Arts and Humanities. And today she's going to talk to us about psychoanalytic theories of mythology. Over to you, Anactoria.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you for the very generous introduction. I'm quite touched and embarrassed. Anyway, let me get on with the lecture. So thank you, everybody, for coming today. I'm a big mythology geek. I really love mythology. Psychoanalytic theories of mythology maybe slightly less than some of the other approaches, but it's a fascinating area. So thank you for joining me while we talk about it. So I called this lecture Uncanny Doubles. This does hark back a little bit to my first PhD, but I named it Uncanny Doubles because of the relationship that mythology and psychology have with one another, and for the pivotal role that Freud played in linking them together. So Freud was also the author of the theory of the uncanny, or unheimlich in the original German. Apologies for my awful German accent. The unheimlich is a strange term, as it embodies both oppositional and relational qualities to heimlich, what we would think of as being the opposite term. So it covers something that is both familiar and yet feels strange, as well as something that is strange to us but also feels familiar. So with mythology and psychoanalysis, as Nadia Sells outlines, both deal with the irrational, both work with stories, and both have to do with interpreting metaphorical language. So both the academic disciplines of mythology and psychoanalysis arise from the study of the other in the self. They both explore the point where language and thinking are founded, yet neither discipline gives clear, definitive answers, often dealing with allegorical interpretation and multiplications of meaning. And sorry, I realise I haven't actually started the slideshow, so I'm going to do that so I can move us on. From the beginning, please. PowerPoint. Sorry, I'm on my work computer. It's a little bit slow at the end of the day. Okay, so a little bit about mythology. It often gets grouped together with legend, with folklore, and with fairy tales, but it tends to be distinct because it deals with the pre-human, with gods and immortals and fantastical creatures, as well as with early mortals. There are, however, many kinds of myth and many functions of myth. They may be entertaining stories, they may be aetiological, explaining the causes of things, they might be euhemeristic, positing that the gods arose out of the deification of historical heroes. Nevertheless, myth conveys an aura of antiquity and at the same time projects a sense of timelessness. And to just define psychoanalysis for ourselves, it's defined as a science of the mind, a science of decoding the meaning of often disparate phenomena, such as hysterical symptoms, dreams, parapraxes, what we colloquially know as Freudian slips, literature, art, religion, and myth. So to Freud and his followers, myth represented a treasure trove of collective unconscious thinking akin to dreams. So Caldwell states that individuals must dream and societies, which are groups of individuals, produce myths as dreams for the group. Myth appears like the anonymous product of a collective process. It's not usually seen as forged by the individual creative mind alone. Myth is a collective experience. So myth is something that people do or make together. An example of this is something that Ben Cassell will be talking about on Thursday, with a specific example, the rituals of honouring Theseus in classical Athens, using a collectively known culture hero and backstory, and allowing those attending the rituals to have a collective experience that forged both collective and cultural memory. So that's a really good example of how myth feeds into collective identity and the collective unconscious. So I highly recommend Ben's lecture to explore this further. However, for psychoanalysts, myth is a fictional, traditional tale which regularly represents through symbolic transformation, unconscious ideas and conflicts. This is because Caldwell states myths function to fulfill a variety of human needs, but emotional needs are primary. The link between myth and dreams is through the function of dreams to preserve mental health by permitting the allowable expression of repressed ideas. And more on this shortly. So in order to use myth in psychoanalysis, we have to accept certain analogies between the development of the individual and the development of whole societies. So Zajko and O'Gorman state that psychoanalysis offers an account of how humans become humans, and also self-consciously appropriates myth and mythic exemplar in order to make broader claims about humanity as a whole. So myths reflect a collective social unconscious, according to Freud, and the individual learns to repress desires through socialization. Maturation of the individual is a process of social repression. So the norms of everyday life is called the reality principle, but some activities need to give people freedom from the restrictions of this all the time. So we have fantasy, we have daydreams, we have creative activity. And myths and art generally, Freud believed, belong to the realm of collective fantasy which mediates between the two. So society needs shared myths, Caldwell asserts, to maintain the emotional integrity and collective health of the group. Its role is to dramatise the concerns of a society, to express something. And so we shift away from what the story is doing. So we shift away from the story to what the story is doing. And Zajko and O'Gorman give us an example of this with the Minotaur. And we see in his story, he progresses from being a monster in a fairly straightforward tale of heroism to he then becomes a complex hybrid creature central to discourses about the boundaries between the human and the bestial. And there was early on a tendency to work quickly and eclectically, which meant that there was often insufficient time in early psychoanalysis, or evidence even, to persuade scholars and professional classicists of their claims. It is suggested that psychoanalytic interpretations lurch towards reductiveness, or tend to generate systematic interpretations that translate the narrative into a set of pre-established truths. However, before we land on psychoanalysis a bit too hard, it's not unique to this. So myth interpretation by the Stoics and the Neoplatonists in antiquity did this too. So we're not going to go into great detail about the Stoics and the Neoplatonists, but just to give you a little bit of an aside to these two philosophical approaches, so we see that there's a tradition of doing this with myth. So the Stoics advocated for inner calmness and emotional stability in the face of adversity. They loved Heracles as an example. They'd use him in their concept. So Heracles had a need for adventure. He would be in pain from the suffering he would be putting himself through, but this pain would be nullified because he was fulfilling a sense of duty. So that's what the Stoics would boil it down to. And the Neoplatonists, they read myth as an allegory as well, Plato and his followers. They took a more religious view in trying to establish that everything originates from a single consciousness. So I'm not going to read out all the slides for you. They're just there to add a little bit of detail if you're wanting them. Okay, so back to mythology and psychoanalysis. So it's not the only way to interpret myths, but it can be particularly useful when considering these aspects of myth interpretation. So myth is really good to think with. It's an important part of the story of humanity. We keep coming back to myth. Different cultures have different myths, but they all have myths. And Freud believed that civilization was gained at the cost of repression, and that myths were the distorted vestiges of the wish fantasies of whole nations, the age-long dreams of young humanity. So myths kind of show us where we came from, show us what we wanted, and we've like kind of learnt to repress this as we've moved into living in societies. And we're also told by psychoanalysts that myth performs vital psychological functions. So it allows the expression of the unconscious, usually repressed ideas, in a conventional and socially sanctioned form. It uses the emotional content attached to these ideas to energize other non-emotional functions of the myth. And it also provides a societal response to psychological needs, whether these are universal or culture specific. And this sort of thing can be exemplified by Freud's reflections on Oedipus Tyrannus. So you've probably heard of the Oedipus complex, which is considered where he considered that there was a sexual desire of the son for his mother, and this relates to a jealousy of his father for having sexual relations with her before him, and then a desire to eliminate his father as a result of this. Jung leveled up the genders because Freud didn't much bother about what young girls might think. He just kind of was focusing on the boys. So Jung, in turn, proposed the Electra complex, as Freud, hadn't considered the other side of the coin. But Freud's use of Oedipus considered that the unconscious content of this myth was still very much available to the modern audience, and that we all undergo this reality of fantasizing about these Oedipal crimes during a stage of our early development. You'll probably see as we go through that I'm a little bit unsure of Freud's findings, but they are what they are here. So the powerful emotional impact of the Oedipus myth is proof, Freud suggests, of the quantity of repression needed to bury this desire in us civilized moderns. So far so bonkers. Let's move on to his interpretation of dreams. So in the interpretation of dreams, he ties in the universal nature of the Oedipal feelings in people with the universal appeal of the myth. So it's a bit of a circular argument, which is troubling to many scholars. I might include myself in there, but it arises from Freud's desire to see in the unalterable workings of fate that plague Oedipus a symbolic expression of a universal human situation. So he wants to think that Oedipus isn't just suffering a unique and individual fate, that actually it says something about all of us. So he suggests everyone has Oedipal content in their dreams, and that in seeing patients who have an ambivalent regard to their parents, often expressed in extreme emotions, that there's a stage of psychosexual development in which one undergoes a dire mental conflict. So we repress these feelings and the divided mind keeps them under house arrest, but sometimes dreaming can lead to a relaxation of repression. So Freud requires us to look at myth as a set of conflicts, symptoms, and compromises, and that Oedipus is not a story of a man's tragic failure to avoid his fate. To Freud, Sophocles was saying more than he could possibly have intended in this play. The link between myth and dreams was explained through wish fulfillment, that myths constitute wish fulfillment and that they are products of fantasy, of a relaxed repression. Myths are therefore a privileged source of information about the unconscious. So just as Fraser, the comparative anthropologist, had noted that the myths and beliefs of so-called savage societies had a great deal in common, no matter where they were located in time and space, he was interested in the psychodynamic of the collective. And so Freud believed that the dream symbols were also universal and could be mapped onto myth symbols. So typical symbols for family members are kings and queens, representing fathers and mothers. Little animals represent children, and so on. Of course, being Freud, there had to be symbols for bodies and genitalia. Female bodies are represented by enclosed spaces, and the gates, doors, and windows represent their genitals. Male genitals, you will probably not be very surprised to hear, can be represented by almost any oblong object, but particular tools, implements, fingers, tongs, snakes, and swords are his favourite ones. However, this is my big beef with Freud, in that he borrowed heavily from the ancient world. We see in this brief extract from the play Oedipus Tyrannus that Jocasta herself anticipates the Oedipus complex. Freud is not original. Oedipus says, I don't have to fear that I'll have sex with my mother. And Jocasta basically says, but men do dream of that. You're fine, you know, that's absolutely fine. This is what happens. So all that Freud has done is he's read the play. So yeah, so that's my big beef with him. But what really attracted Freud to Sophocles' play was the manner in which, despite great internal resistance, the hero relentlessly pursues a quest of self-discovery, reaching back into the trauma of his earliest childhood, where he discovers that the true relation to his father and mother are at extreme odds of what is socially acceptable. He thought that the whole procedure was comparable to a work of psychoanalysis. And Freud implies that through this speech, Sophocles intuited the existence of the Oedipus complex through his knowledge of myths and dreams, and that this is the key to the tragedy. It is the universal psychological content that makes this tragedy exceptional. Just as a quick aside, Freud also wasn't original in his focus on interpreting dreams. Artemidorus, who is one of my favourite, most bonkers people from the ancient world, was a Greek dream interpreter living in the Roman Empire, and he was a travelling interpreter. He wrote 5 dream manuals. The first 3 were dedicated to his patron. The last 2 were dedicated to his son, who was basically going to take over the family business. And he talks here about what we would say is the Oedipus complex, sex with one's mother in dreams. And there's a whole section. I mean, I've just given you a brief extract. If you want to go and look at it, there's a massive section which goes through all the different sexual positions, whether the mother is alive or dead, whether the dreamer is ill or well, and whether the father is alive or dead. So he intends to cover all bases. It's a fascinating text. And it is now available in a fairly cheap Penguin version, if anybody is desperate to read early dream interpretation. Okay, let's move to Freud's only extended myth analysis. So he spoke a lot about myth and psychoanalysis, but he didn't do a huge amount of detailed work in this area. He only really looked at the Prometheus myth. So what we have on the slide is what he came up with in terms of the mythical symbols and what he related them to. So Prometheus is credited with giving fire, but he forbade watering. So the fennel stalk contained fire, but the penis is symbolized and contains water. So the inversion of fire and water is inverted itself in the related myth of Heracles, who releases Prometheus and kills the eagle. So Freud is very much kind of casting his net wide from the mythical narratives here. Heracles kills the Hydra, a water snake, but one that has multiple raging heads like fire. So like fire, it's a libido symbol, and like Prometheus' liver, the severed heads regenerate. But the water snake is finally extinguished by fire, since Heracles, or his companion Iolaus, is forced to cauterize the snake's heads to keep them from regenerating. So this water extinguished by fire also symbolizes the libido that was repressed when Prometheus curbed man's impulse to pass his water onto the fire. So oddly, Freud supposes that real people and events are behind the myth here, which is a bit of a worry. He casts Prometheus as a lawgiver who forbade urinating on fire, but Prometheus is a lawgiver who forbade urinating on fire, but Heracles is a lawbreaker who redeemed Prometheus by using his water to extinguish a fire that had grown dangerous. I think for anybody who might be familiar with Gulliver's Travels, that Freud might have also dipped into 16th, 17th century literature for this. And Eric Scarpo, the scholar, suggests that the analysis might be a little bit more convincing had the natural impulse to urinate on fire survived with sufficient vigour to extinguish our doubts as well. So a nice little bit of mythology snark there. So whilst that's the only extended analysis that Freud did in terms of myth, he did jot down some ideas about the Gorgon's head, about Medusa. So he suggests that the sight of Medusa's head makes one rigid with fear. Growing rigid means erection, And so in the original situation, it's the consolation of the viewer. He still has a penis and he confirms it by getting an erection. So Athena, the virgin goddess, carries this symbol of horror on her clothes, rightly so, since by it she becomes an unapproachable woman who wards off all sexual advances by displaying the fearful genitals of the mother. So Freud suggests that this depiction of the woman threatening man with his own castration is only to be expected of the thoroughly homosexual Greeks. Do feel free to eye roll here. And again, Eric Sarpo makes the point that despite Freud being obsessed with the story of Oedipus and the Sphinx, he never analysed the myth, although he made free use of it to illustrate his psychoanalytic argument. And Sarpo suggests that the genealogy of the Sphinx offers abundant confirmation of Freud's observations on the Medusa. So Freud interpreted rampant phallic symbolism of Medusa as a form of compensation for the fear of castration. So this symbolism could be extended to the children of the Medusa, as there's a high degree of consistency in the monstrosities of her lineage. All of them are threatening monsters, and all of them are surrounded by phallic symbolism. Chrysaor, the giant with the sword who came from her neck, begot Geryon and Echidna. Geryon is represented as triplets from the waist up. Echidna is half woman, half snake, and she married Typhon, who is described by Hesiod as a creature of 100 snake heads with darting tongues and fiery eyes. So Echidna and Typhon gave birth to Cerberus, who in some of the older mythological texts is said to have 50 heads, a dragon for a tail, and rings of snakes wriggling at the back of each neck. So they also bore the two-headed dog of Geryon, the one that Heracles killed, which is something I can never forgive Heracles for. The dragon with the 100 heads, which guards the apples of the Hesperides, and the eagle that ate out Prometheus's liver every day, as well as the Lernaean hydra, which had 1 immortal and 8 regenerative heads, and the chimera, a composite of lion, goat, and snake, the Nemean lion, and also the Sphinx. So these creatures are often many-headed, most are snaky, some are tripartite, and all have a phallic nature, which Freud identified in Medusa. The Sphinx is special, Sarpo suggests, because she is not only threatening, but she's also a little bit sexy. And you might just have to be your own judge of that, whether that is something you find attractive. But here we've got the Ingres painting of Oedipus and the Sphinx, with which Freud was fascinated. He had it in his study. And Oedipus fixes his eyes on the Sphinx's breasts, which are highlighted in light, and her monstrous features remain in a penumbra in shadow. So Freud's fascination with the painting had something to do with its ambivalent nature of erotic desire combined with fear and loathing. So in Greek art, the Sphinx is often depicted as a voluptuous woman lunging at young men in their prime and raping them as she shreds them apart, which the vase on the right-hand side gets slightly closer to that. And this is perhaps a slightly less sexy element of the Sphinx. However, psychoanalysis can decode myths. We see myths, religions, and great artists able to send messages, but only a psychoanalytic can understand and unveil their psychic truth. A myth is the encoded expression of childhood experience and of a belief system we find hard to recognize as adults. So the first step in interpretation is a synopsis of human development, followed by a checklist of common modes of encryption that take unconscious fantasies or memories and turn them into mythic narratives. And here we have the psychoanalytic process. So unconscious thinking is known as the primary process. It uses modes different to our conscious thinking, but commonly found in dreaming or poetry. So in trying to understand a myth, we need to look for the processes of condensation, where one element may represent numerous things, and displacement, where emotional energy linked to one element may be displaced onto a similar but different element. And these processes transform the latent content in the narrative, the deep psychological concerns surrounding the intergenerational strife and individual development, into the manifest content of the myth. So condensation can cause meanings to be overdetermined, and is the equivalent of the literary term of ambiguity, where things can signify and mean different and often opposing things. And this isn't necessarily a problem in literature. Ambiguity can add to the richness of a text. Defense mechanism allows the unconscious to defend itself from the unthinkable related to the unconscious. And if we use the myth of Oedipus for the next three terms, symbolism can refer to the three roads meeting place, the crossroads, as the meeting of the three fates of Laius, Jocasta, and Oedipus. Overdetermination might also see it make a Y shape suggestive of the vulva. Oedipus bludgeons his father to death with a walking stick, also a scepter, a staff of office, and a phallic symbol. With blindness, splitting can be seen in figures where there is both intense love and hatred for them, and then they become a very good and a very bad figure. So the two fathers of Oedipus represent this splitting. Projection externalizes an internal desire or conflict by putting it onto another person. So Oedipus is, to Freud, the projective scapegoat for our collective Oedipal guilt. So it's easy here to see how overdetermination might lead to overinterpretation. And Freud himself was aware that there might be issues with just assuming direct correlations to things. And in therapy, interpretations would be cross-checked with a patient to see how relevant and useful they are. So we are kind of very much taking the psychoanalytic process out of working with an individual and just looking at the steps. But cultural knowledge of the unconscious or latent content of the myth is essential to being a good analyst. So we have different reinterpretations of Oedipus. And Heinz Kohut later also came out against reading Oedipus as a conflict narrative and utilised the relationship between Odysseus and Telemachus in the Odyssey, in which Odysseus tries to avoid going off to Troy by feigning madness and ploughing his field until Palamedes puts Telemachus in front of the plough and Oedipus swerves to avoid him. So Kohut uses another myth to suggest that it's a healthy embracing of the older generation of the next generation as an extension of his own. So there has been quite a lot of pushback against having mythical relationships always as a source of conflict. Freud was not on his own, though, right at the beginning of setting up this idea of using mythology and psychoanalysis. He worked with Jung. They were colleagues for a while, but they very much dissented over how the unconscious relates to modern man. So Jung built on his work, but he very much developed into a more complex view of the collective unconscious. And you might have heard of the term archetypes, which is very much a Jungian development. They're kind of particular figures, particular types, but they are also difficult to determine. But he thinks that humans share this collective unconscious that's myth-making in nature, mythopoetic. So the myth stays relevant to us, and it's a powerful source of insight into our unconscious minds and motivation. So Jungians remain committed to the idea that mythological knowledge is an essential adjunct to therapeutic work and psychological insight. So we should all be cheered that looking at mythology starts to prepare us to become Jungian psychoanalysts, should we wish to become them. However, the difficulty with Jung's archetypes is that they cannot be reduced to a single formula. So it's very difficult to pin down. I've called it on this slide a slippery fish, because we can't necessarily directly relate a particular archetype to a particular thing. It's a vessel which we can never empty and which we can never fill. So it has potential existence only, and when it takes shape in matter, it is no longer what it was. So it persists throughout the ages and requires interpreting ever anew. But the archetypes are imperishable elements of the unconscious, but they change shape continuously. And again, this would be teased out in conversation with an individual. So Freudians would try to chop up and decode a mythic narrative, but Jungians would try to adhere to the more obvious message of the myth or dream and its symbols. So explication here refers to expounding the manifest content, the content as it is remembered. Amplification, so it's a subsequent investigation of what the symbols mean, such as questing serpents, sphinxes, mother figures, have embodied historically in human culture, and that's where the mythological knowledge comes in. And then with active imagination, this is the mediation that seeks to bridge the conscious and the unconscious by deploying a creative skill. Jungians would want you to run with the elements that are manifesting themselves. They're deeply committed to autonomy and priority of myth. They think it's not just a vestige of the primitive past, but it's a system that functions in the present. And their injunction is to dream the myth forward as one forges one's selfhood in a distinctive contribution. And that's the distinctive contribution of Jungian psychology to the modern uses of myth, that they don't just try and decode it as it is, but they try and dream it forward and get the person involved in going beyond what they've dreamt. So whilst Freud and Jung might be considered amongst the first to yoke together mythology and psychoanalysis, others followed. Interest in the 19th century considered it to be a marker of the primitive mind and were frequently concerned that the high culture Greek gods shared features with barbaric, irrational and immoral imaginations of the so-called inferior races. So Max Muller made such a comparison with Native American stories, albeit he did suggest that the Greek gods would have been shown to be more barbaric than the Native Americans would have been accustomed to. But what all the theorists shared was the claim that there was one key by which all myths could be interpreted. So with Max Muller, all myths were distorted forms of solar and lunar theories. Edward Tyler, primitive science, natural phenomenon in anthropomorphic terms, so we're explaining the weather. And James Fraser, that all myth metaphors refer back to the cycle of nature and agriculture. But basically, we're all looking at allegorical interpretation. So reading myth as an allegory as subservient to the true message hidden under it was a feature of 19th century psychologists, but 20th century theorists tend to try and read myth as a language in its own right. So Ernst Cassirer believes that myth provided humans with their first means of structuring the world, that reality cannot be experienced as such but needs to be mediated by symbolic forms, and that myth is the most primitive of these, that myth does not refer to any external reality because it in itself constructs reality. So to explore this, we'll return to Zajko and O'Gorman's example of the Minotaur. They make the case of Ovid's Metamorphoses being proto-psychoanalytic, but this is also highlighted through his description of the Minotaur in the Ars Amatoria. Excuse my awful Latin accent. Semi-bovem que virum, semi-virum que bovem, both half bullman and half man-bull, which becomes problematic when we consider what his consciousness might be. They also highlight visual depictions of the Minotaur as a baby being nursed by Pasiphae, which we see on this Kylix, because it invites the viewer to consider the Minotaur as a more well-rounded character, as a creature with desires and relationships. And they also highlight the role of the artist in filling in the gaps of the Minotaur's childhood. And this is what I suggest is what modern classical reception texts are currently doing too. So there's been a huge surge in mythologically based narratives, often female authored, considering female monsters such as Medusa, slighted mythological figures such as Clytemnestra, or even barely visible women such as Briseis from the Iliad. So they're filling the gaps and reimagining the psychological motivations for their actions, giving them a rich inner life. They are using the collective unconscious located in the mythic archive. To return, though, to symbolic representation, Hans Blumenberg takes this idea further, believing that man's symbolic mediation of the universe always implies a certain imperfection. For him, myth is not stable. It's an ongoing process, groping for significance. It is work on myth, in which new allegories and translations can be provided that can be more effective than the old one. One of the more recent psychoanalytic approaches to myth comes from Claude Levi-Strauss. He took a structuralist view of mythology, that the illness was the same symbolic nature as the cure, that if the symbols and stories could cure the patient, then that was also what was curing the illness. He also explored the idea that mythological narratives were made up of building blocks of meaning, mythemes, similar to Vladimir Prop's actants and functions from his exploration of similar characters and actions in Russian folk tales, which you might have heard of. So here on this slide, we see a deconstruction of two mythological narratives in which he identifies bloodlines as important features, as well as both monsters trying to kill mankind and man overcomes the supernatural to save society. Lacan used this structuralism in his theory of the unconscious, that it is the discourse of the other and structured like language. His theory is that language, the symbolic, constructs both reality and the self by separating the two. So Lacan's theory distinctly jumps off from Levi Strauss's work on myth, in which conflicts cannot be resolved by problems and can be addressed by exploring similar contradictions in other aspects. And Lacan reflected on the mythical status of psychoanalysis itself. I'm not going to read out this quotation, but it is, again, quite circular in argument. Okay, so up to now, we are approaching the end. Up to now, there's been an overwhelming preponderance in this lecture to explore the theories of dead white men, but female and feminist approaches to psychoanalysis are as present as female-authored mythological retellings. So Ronnie Ancona highlights the utility of exploring real-world women's issues by turning to images of mighty women from the past. She also reiterates the interconnectedness of the disciplines, suggesting that each generation's new interpretations can make us see retrospectively the earlier versions anew. Thus, myth contributes to psychoanalysis, but psychoanalysis also contributes to the study of myth, because the myth becomes new in each of its instantiations. So Ancona further suggests that Medea is a useful mythological figure to think with, because her students respond to different parts of her story in different ways, and also the fact that her mythological narrative differs in different texts or privileges different aspects, such as her divinity, her foreignness, and her infanticide. Lucille Spira explores Helen of Troy as an analogous figure. Sorry, I'm having problems with A words today. To hypothetical female victims of rape. And she suggests that she's also useful because our modern psychoanalytic theory suggests that all of our behaviours gratify both sexual and aggressive wishes. So Spira considers her hypothetical teenage victim to harbour ideas of revenge, as she considers Helen might have done after her abduction and rape by Theseus. That she might use her beauty and power to gain the upper hand, as Helen might have done through her voyage to Troy with Paris. And that by using drugs to stop Menelaus bringing up her infidelity and its consequences time and time again, that she needs to escape her inner torturer. So the applicability of the figure of Helen is, Spira asserts, because of her ambiguity. Her motivations are not well defined, and how people identify with her depends on, and can perhaps reveal to the psychoanalyst, their own psychology. So much more could be said on the purposes of myth in terms of religion and ritual, and their differentiation between fables and folk tales. However, the more recent explanation of using mythology to explore the human mind focuses upon turning abstract and threatening concepts into things that are more concrete and manageable. So psychologists using myth believe that they are the stuff of all dreams and that they contain certain important truths on what it is to be human. However much their theories resonate or not with you, what is demonstrated by psychological interpretations of myth is just how useful myths are. They have universal qualities that keep us interested, and they clearly continue to speak to us on important matters and ideas. Whether they explain our psychologies or not, myths embody what it is to be human, and they provide fresh entertainment and exploration for each generation anew. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Anactoria.